Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm going to do another little chat that I've been doing, a music-related chat. I enjoy it so much. I enjoy talking about music. And I've reviewed several autobiographies on the channel, but this is another one I'm going to review tonight. Levon Helm, This Wheel's on Fire. Levon Helm and the Story of the Band. It's a really good... And I've reviewed several autobiographies on the channel. Dr. John, that's one of my favorites. If you haven't seen that one, not too many people have watched that one. Eric Clapton, Keith Richards, Patty Boyd. But this is another one I'm going to review tonight. Levon Helm, This Wheel's on Fire. Levon Helm and the Story of the Band. It's a really good book. This book came out in 1993. Levon Helm was 53 years old, and he lived another 20 years, but there's already kind of a sense of, the really important stuff, it seems like, was over. I mean, I'm not trying to say he didn't do anything interesting in the later 90s and early 2000s, but it really has that focus on the height of Levon Helm's career. And of course, what a lot of people will be interested in is the band. I think in any book, and it's true here, you always have that tension between how much detail to include, but also how much to kind of help the reader with the kind of readable flow. A lot of these books are probably, people pick up a rock or music autobiography like this. It might be something they think they'd like to read on an airplane or maybe in a hotel room. And so that would probably be kind of just a kind of an enjoyable book. And you have that aspect of the book, but then you also have the sense that, hey, this is my life. These were important events. I lived through them. No one else can talk about them, and I want to include a lot of these details. And I see that in so many of these autobiographies. And I think Levon Helm's book has a lot of detail, but it also has that kind of big picture flow. The detail is handled pretty well, I think. Now, you might say there's quite a bit of detail, but I'm glad it's there because, like I said, Levon Helm's not around anymore, and neither are a lot of these other people. Richard Manuel's gone, Rick Danko's gone, not to mention a lot of the other people he mentions. So I think the book straddles that pretty well. There is a lot of detail in the book, but I think it's well done. I think the Eric Clapton autobiography was an example of a book that kind of flowed really well for the reader and had pretty good detail. On the other hand, I'm a big Clapton fan, and I kind of found myself wanting more detail. But I imagine a lot of readers probably found it, just kind of enjoyable to just kind of go through this life of Clapton. But you always have that tension. I guess that's probably true in any book, but, it's certainly true in like a autobiography. On the one hand, you want it to be a book people read. On the other hand, it's getting your story out there. And when you're not around, there's not anyone else to give a lot of these details. So you kind of have to walk that fine line. I think this book does. There's a pretty good level of detail in it. The other thing I wanted to say about this book, just as a kind of overview at the beginning, is it's very interesting about his background. You know, when I talked about Keith Richards or Clapton, and I'm hoping to review the Paul McCartney autobiography in the near future, probably the same. You have that background of post-war England, you know, with the rations and, you know, just a world that you can't really go back to. And that's interesting in so many ways, and it's certainly interesting in music. The Dr. John autobiography really was interesting because he has that kind of pre-1960s New Orleans background, which that's a really interesting world. And that's not a whole country. That's one city that's got so much music and culture in it. And Dr. John was kind of a fossil specimen of old New Orleans, and his music was just so great. But the best parts of that Dr. John book were kind of reading through all the descriptions of all his life in New Orleans when he was a kid and when he was a young guy playing in all those clubs and all the colorful characters and great musicians he played with, and that kind of world, which is, again, a world you can't go back to. And so I was thinking, some of these people, you really have a sense that they come from a special time and place that you can't go back to. And so when you listen to their music, you're listening to a specimen of a sort of an artifact from another time, and they're here to share something from a world that's kind of gone. I saw Doc Watson one time. I saw him a couple times, but I really had that sense, you know, this is this old man, this mountain flat picker, you know, playing stuff that really went back to the Civil War, you know, and all these mountain music. Well, Levon Helm is really like that, and he's got another one of these interesting backgrounds you can't really, I don't think, go all the way back to, which is Arkansas. And, you know, he was from an interesting place in Arkansas. He's from Turkey Scratch, Arkansas, and I guess he might be, his background, some people might call it a hillbilly background. I think his house was on stilts, or a lot of the houses where he was raised were. And he's also, I think, from an area that's in and around the Black Belt. And if you think, which is, I think a lot of those areas around that area are 80% African American. Now, if you think about that, that's a really interesting mix, and it's so important in American music. You have kind of white Southern music, like gospel music, and what we would today, these labels don't always apply very well when you go back, but what we would today maybe call bluegrass or country music. But then you also have, it's an area where blues came out of. Memphis isn't that far away. You have sort of the Cajun music even kind of creeping in there. You've got Midwestern music styles. So in the Last Waltz, Levon Helm kind of says that that's kind of the middle of the country, and you get like gospel and country and blues and jazz. You have all those different elements, big band even, you know, and it all kind of mixes up. And I think he says when it all got mixed up, that's what we call rock and roll. And he kind of makes a joke out of it, but it's really true. But in this book, you get this really interesting take on his Arkansas background. And again, I always find those early years to be especially instructive. And Levon Helm, again, he's kind of like Dr. John, Keith Richards. He's a product of a world you can't really go back to. He was authentic. He wasn't, you know, someone that studied music in school and decided to, you know, sing this style or that style because he liked it. He was a product of a world, and the music that he sang was of that world he was from, and it's a world that's kind of gone. It's that old, I don't want to say it's gone if you're from that area and it's still vibrant. I don't, you know, I'll stand corrected, but I feel like, you know, that old sort of pre-television, fast food strips, and, you know, that old kind of rural Arkansas. but it's a really interesting area. He was raised not too far from Conway Twitty. What was Conway's Twitty? He says Conway Twitty was a stage name, and that was interesting to me because Conway Twitty, when I was a kid, was a big country star, but he started out as rock and roll, kind of like Elvis or Jerry Lee Lewis, or the other guy that gets talked about in here a lot, who is Ronnie Hawkins. So, but it's a really interesting period. You know, when Levon Helm was little, they listened to a lot of music on the radio. There was actually a show called the King Biscuit Music Hour or something like that, which is not to be confused with the 70s show. And they also used to have music shows on the side of town that were set up in tents. It almost sounded like a revival, but they would just be music shows, and they'd have people come from all over the country to these music shows. He heard Bill Monroe there, so he had a kind of an interesting background. He grew up hearing a lot of kind of mountain gospel. He also grew up hearing a lot of music like Bill Monroe. And he says something interesting about Bill Monroe. Of course, he said Bill Monroe took all those old American songs and sped them up, and that today is what we call bluegrass. So I never liked the term bluegrass. I don't like the term classic rock either, really. But what we call bluegrass was really kind of sped up old American music, and Bill Monroe kind of invented that. And Levon Helm listened to Bill Monroe, saw him in those early years. So that's a really special background. And he also mentions Muddy Waters as a really important influence. So think about those. And when you think about the music of the band, and indeed a lot of rock and roll in general, but when you think about the music of the band particularly, it was rock, it was blues, but it had that kind of earthy, organic American sound that made it so different from some of the other stuff that came out. And I think when you look at Levon Helm, you really see why that is. And Robbie Robertson, who was from Canada, but Robbie Robertson, when he was a teenager, was already playing with those same guys. They weren't called the band at that time, but they were called with Ronnie Hawkins and the Hawks. And he went to Arkansas and kind of fell in love, and he realized the power of the musical culture of Arkansas. So a lot of those, even though the rest of the band, as we know them, the classic band lineup anyway, was most of those guys were Canadian. The Levon Helm influence was really important because all those Canadian guys in the band traveled through America and picked up a lot of those influences. So these Arkansas sections are really, really interesting. And he goes through a lot of it. Now he started playing, and he has some of the colorful stories of his youth. Gotten a lot of fist fights on the bus. By the way, I feel like I don't know. Certainly not advocating it, but Keith Richards got in a lot of fights, and I don't know. It's just kind of interesting because that used to be sort of a boyhood rite of passage, and now I think we call 911 or something. But anyway, he was kind of a scrappy little kid. Now, when he was a teenager, fairly young, I forget his exact age, but pretty young, he started playing with a rock and roll singer named Ronnie Hawkins that was also from that part of Arkansas, but was kind of developing. Now, Ronnie Hawkins was the cousin of a guy named Dale Hawkins, who does that great song, Susie Q. So, and that's... That's kind of a good tip, Susie Q, which I grew up hearing the CCR version of that song, but Susie Q, or Who Do You Love by Bo Diddley, that's the kind of stuff they did. So Levon Helm started playing with this version with Ronnie Hawkins, and that was called the Hawks. The rest of the Hawks, when he started out, they were all American guys, but over time, Ronnie Hawkins started traveling through Canada with Levon Helm, and over time a lot of the Americans kind of left the band and they were replaced by Canadians, which were what we would today call the band. That would be Rick Danko, Garth Hudson, Richard Manuel, and Robbie Robertson. And then Levon Helm was kind of the only American left in that band, even though they become so kind of synonymous with America. Of course, Canada's part of America, isn't it? North America, yeah. So in some, that's appropriate. But this Ronnie Hawkins was really interesting. He was a big, affable, easygoing guy, good-looking guy back then, and Levon Helm says he was just colorful, politically incorrect as all hell. He'd probably last about 2 seconds today, but just funny as hell. And he had a pretty good rock band. He said, Levon Helm said he was a classic, more of an entertainer than a musician. By the way, I've played with people that I would describe as great entertainers. Most of them were also good musicians, but I guess if you think about it, somebody who's a great entertainer is a good thing. This Ronnie Hawkins was a great entertainer, funny. But I read somewhere he had what they called the point and play method. So they weren't much for practicing. He'd fill his band with good players, and they'd do stuff like Bo Diddley or Susie Q, and Who Do You Love, and stuff like that. But he would point, like, you take a solo, and he'd point, and then you'd take a solo, and then he'd point at the piano player, you'd take a solo. So but if you think about it, that's kind of good live, everybody would, so that they developed a pretty good live show, and they traveled around a lot. And then Ronnie Hawkins became quite a significant, I would say maybe B level, kind of a B movie, but he was a national touring artist, and they went into Canada. And then Ronnie Hawkins is actually considered pretty influential in the introduction of rock and roll music, American style rock and roll music, if you think about it, because a lot of that stuff was like Elvis. If you think about it, like that kind of music maybe is characterized simply for us today is like Elvis, Jerry Lee Lewis, people like that. There were a ton more though. 50s rock was great, and I sometimes think we overlook the greatness of 50s rock, because we get these kind of Happy Days images, and 50s rock was really good. But this Ronnie Hawkins was really colorful character. And like I said, he probably would, his mouth would have been getting him in trouble every 2 seconds today, but he was just funny, dirty jokes on stage, and, all kinds of women around. But anyway, but they replaced while they were in Canada, they ended up replacing most of the American guys in the Hawks with the Canadian guys. That would be the band we know. Richard Manuel, who has such a beautiful voice, Rick Danko, and one of my favorites, I think he's kind of an unsung hero, is Garth Hudson. And Levon Helm was talking a little bit about Garth Hudson, who was a multi-instrumentalist. You often saw him at organ, but he was a multi-instrumentalist, played a great saxophone. I really related to him because he had a similar background to me. He was from, I think, southwestern Ontario. I don't know the exact town. But, I was raised in Michigan, and those kind of culturally, they aren't too far apart. And he had kind of a, Hudson, I'm assuming that's kind of an English, North American background, and that's what my mother's side was. And he grew up listening to a lot of hymns like Abide With Me and Near the Cross, and those are great. They're a great background, and that's an important part of rock and roll music, not just gospel, like we often say gospel, but hymns, because a lot of people of that generation, and I guess I'm not of that generation exactly, but I include myself in this. So you grew up on classic hymns. That's whatever your beliefs take you in life. That's such a good musical background. So I read that about Garth Hudson, and it made me like him even more. That he used to play in funeral parlors, even, which I've done. I actually play a lot of funerals, but like Abide With Me and Near the Cross, and those are really nice hymns. They're not like all those the kind of campground revival hymns we often associate with American Christianity, but they're really nice kind of English hymns, really, really good American English. slash hymns. And so Garth Hudson was just terrific, and a lot of people say he was the best one in the band. Then they also met this guy named Robbie Robertson, who was like 15. He was pretty young, and he started hanging around the band and was actually pretty talented, but he was too young. So Ronnie Hawkins didn't want to let him in the band. But he started even traveling with the band, kind of hanging around, doing errands. And then finally, at some point, Ronnie Hawkins invited Robbie Robertson to join the band as he got a little older, and they saw his talent. And that was the version of Ronnie Hawkins and the Hawks, and the Hawks basically became the band. I think Ronnie Hawkins and the band parted ways around 1964, and that's after they played all kinds of honky-tonks, road trips all over. And for a while after Ronnie Hawkins left, the band, kind of, Levon Helm was the front man for the band for a while, and they did some different things. Of course, one of the things, Levon Helm is also a very fine musician. He plays great drums. It's not like he actually played guitar at first, good musical rhythm guitar and mandolin you often saw him playing. And he kind of picked up on drums because, drums is one of those things, you need a good musician to play them. I always think there are a lot of bashers out there on drums, but, to find a really good musician that has a sense of songs and feel. And so Levon Helm, but he was a great singer, and so he was actually kind of the front man of the post Ronnie Hawkins Hawks. But then in 1966, they got invited, I hope that date is right, they got invited to back up a guy named Bob Dylan. Now, Bob Dylan had recently gone electric, and that was controversial. And they became kind of his electric backup band. I was looking, they recorded, of course, the Basement tapes, and Robbie Robertson's on a few tracks on, like, Blonde on Blonde here and there. But they were mostly Dylan's live touring band for quite a few years. But one of the things is, when Dylan went electric, of course, he was booed and everything, but they were too loud. I've played with people that were too loud, and I don't care what you're playing. It's possible to be too loud if you're relative to what you're trying to do. You might be trying to play Ted Nugent, and it's still possible, because when Ted Nugent takes a solo, everybody else needs to come down. I don't care. You still have to have dynamics. And someone, a really musical player like Levon Helm, he has dynamics, and he said one of the things is Dylan's electric band was always so loud, and that was part of the criticism. So when the band, what we later call the band, they weren't the band right away, but they started backing Dylan, and his electric rock sound that sort of became a signature sound in that period kind of settled down, and the Levon Helm's drums was integral in that. It kind of brought the volume down, and they because they were such good backing musicians, they knew how to support Dylan, and not sort of drown him out literally and figuratively. So that was a really good relationship, and he goes through a lot of that. Now, and they walk through a lot of the years of fame, the tours, and that's kind of interesting. You get some of the wrecked hotel rooms and all the antics. I kind of glossed over some of those parts. But then the other interesting thing you get, and I think, is this discussion of the Last Waltz, which Levon Helm is really critical of. You might know that. And I'm actually going to do a follow-up video focusing on the topic of Robbie Robertson versus Levon Helm. I don't know if Robbie Robertson ever sort of publicly had ill will towards Levon Helm, but Levon Helm certainly was very critical of Robbie Robertson. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a separate video because it's such an interesting topic to me. But the Last Waltz was really interesting, and it happened when but Levon Helm was totally opposed to the idea, as classic as that movie became, because Robbie Robertson basically did the Last Waltz because he wanted to leave the band and kind of go out with the big hurrah. And of course, they signed all these deals. One of the interesting things, there was a lot of money involved, And Levon Helm didn't get much money out of that. I think they got a stipend for a while as the band. But if you think about it, Robbie Robertson wrote all those songs, so he was making a fortune. And by the Last Waltz, elevated all those great songs. The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down, Ophelia, Shape I'm In, Cripple Creek, It Makes No Difference, all those wonderful songs. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that because some of the bad blood, if you will, between Levon Helm and Robbie Robertson had to do with the Last Waltz very specifically. And if you're like me and you just grew up thinking it was an awesome movie, great concert, I wish I could have been there, look at all the guest stars, it's interesting to read how some of the members of the band, particularly Levon Helm, were so opposed to doing it because of what it represented in terms of their history and also the financial ramifications. So, and I'm going to talk about that in a separate video, so I hope you watch that. But I guess, they made there was kind of a stipend for the band for a while after that movie came out and the album, and then the band was over. So that was their last concert, and the band actually revived. I actually saw the band at Royal Oak Music Theater, I think around my 83 or 84. And they were good. So I can, till to the end of my life, I'll be able to say I saw Richard Manuel, Rick Danko, Garth Hudson, and Levon Helm, particularly the two dead ones, Rick Danko and Richard Manuel. But I guess it was kind of one of those deals where everybody was missing Robbie Robertson. But nonetheless, it was a great show. But he kind of talks about, trying to get the band back together without Robbie Robertson. They did, and of course, those four guys, had enough stature, and of course they could always put together a good band, that they managed to stay pretty active playing when they wanted to. Levon Helm was in a couple of movies. Coal Miner's Daughter, I remember seeing that. Gosh, I don't even remember when that came out, but I saw it with my parents. So that tells you I was still hanging around my parents back then. So it's been out a long time ago. But pretty interesting story. Of course, Levon tragically died of cancer. It was 2013. I'll stand corrected. And had kind of his own theater there, and I actually know quite a few people that not only went to one show, but some people that lived in that area, used to go to them all the time. There was kind of a group of regulars, and died. And to some extent, that bad blood with Robbie Robertson, at least Levon towards Robbie, I don't think that was ever really resolved all the way. So I'm sure when you made such great music together, the band, they were together with Ronnie Hawkins 8 years, and then as the band another 8 years, so that's 16 years. It's like being married, so there's a lot of complicated feelings in history, but this book is pretty good. I think the one takeaway I would come away with is Levon Helm was a colorful character, kind of scrappy. Seems like the kind of guy that would do anything for you. Just don't ever do him wrong, And that's a good kind of person, Don't ever f with him, as they would say. But just a good guy, a people person, and a great artist. I think he has one of the signature voices in American music, really. And one of the things I'm going to say in this other video, I don't want to get into it because I'm going to make another video on Levon Helm versus Robbie Robertson, but it's true Robbie Robertson wrote all those great songs, and that's the one thing I think Levon never really, I don't know if he ever seemed to fully appreciate how great those songs were. But the other thing is, Levon Helm sang a lot of those great songs, and Levon Helm was the voice. I think Richard Manuel sang The Shape I'm In. They all sang kind of, but Levon Helm was the voice on a lot of those great, like Ophelia, The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down, The Wait. And it was a great partnership, and it's always sad when you see those kind of things come to an end, all things come to an end, but when you see them come to an end with animosity and sort of life grudges afterwards, that's sad. But this is a good book, and the parts I would especially recommend are those sections on Arkansas, because again, that's kind of Americana music, and he was raised in the 40s and early 50s in Arkansas, around all kinds of great kind of organic, indigenous almost North American music, southern and kind of middle of the country music, and also a lot of early rock and roll. I mean, he was a product of the pre-Beatles rock and roll, American rock and roll, and it's great to read about. So those were my favorite parts of the book. And then towards the end, when he talked about the Last Waltz, that you just couldn't help but be interested in his take on it, because that's one of the great concert movies and albums ever made, one of the great concerts ever. But it was interesting to read his take on it, which decidedly adds a different flavor to your understanding of the show and everything it entailed before, during, and after. But 100% respect for Levon Helm and all the members of the band. And this is a good book. If you've got rock autobiographies, I recommend you add it to your collection. I think you'll enjoy it, and especially focus on those early years in Arkansas. It's a window into American music which is so appropriate for the band, because they sort of, as much as any rock and roll band I can think of, they were they kind of were a composite of all the American music, whatever American music is. Sometimes I'm not sure, but all the different sort of traditional American music styles put into sort of a rock and roll bag, and that was the band. And what a great band they were. Levon Helm was such an important part of it. R.I.P. Definitely recommend this book. God bless you.